All right, so to begin, as Murray stated, we're going to be studying the criminal mind and entering into a world that is not understood, nor should it be, by many people in society. So what I am hoping to cover today is a full spectrum of topics to help our viewers understand all of the different facets of the criminal mind and how it affects different segments of our society. So the first thing we'll be going into is what is the criminal mind and what is evil and how do we conceptualize that and how does society react to it. And then what I will be sharing with you is what I present to law enforcement when I am consulting with them on a case, which is the typologies of the criminal mind. And what I do with law enforcement is review the entire cold case file, and I will narrow down their suspect pool until we reach the perpetrator based on these typologies, and I'll explain that process a little later. And the next topic I'll be discussing with you all is the actual concept of cold cases and the frequency of them and why they are more prone to occur in the United States as opposed to the many other countries that we have visiting with us today. I will also be touching on the area of research that I did for my dissertation at the University of Southern Mississippi. And what I did with that was take, again, from the brilliant mind of Carl Jung, the concept of a cultural complex and work towards understanding why certain victims are more likely to be sought out by perpetrators. And the next topic will be criminality and society. And in this segment, what I'd like to discuss is how we, particularly in the United States, project our own shadows onto these offenders in terms of shunning them and punishing them, whereas many of them could be receiving treatment and being rehabilitated. And the last topic I wanted to discuss with everyone is the law enforcement response to the criminal mind, because as Murray said, this is an extremely dark and precarious field, and law enforcement officials, no matter how long they have been in this field, will carry the weight of the cases that they have worked over the duration of their tenure as an officer. And going to the next slide, when I picture evil as being an individual in criminal justice, this is the image that comes to mind, and the duality of a persona and then the shadow. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with this gentleman. His name is Theodore Robert Bundy, and he was an American serial killer, and he confessed eventually to 30 murders in 7 states between the years of 1974 and 1978. We know that there are many more victims out there that he did not confess to. And to speak about Ted Bundy's criminality, he was born to an unwed mother in 1946, and he was actually raised to believe that his mother was his sister. His mother later remarried, and he took the last name Bundy. His original last name was Cowell. And then he had a relatively normal childhood, aside from being led to believe that his mother was his sister. He eventually figured that out, and the fact that he was, in his own words, a bastard, because he had no contact with his father. And so Ted Bundy went on to college, and he fell in love with a young woman who was she was very high socioeconomic status, absolutely beautiful, had long dark hair parted in the middle, which you will see as a theme in these women in the center. Moving on to the anger typologies, the 2 anger typologies we see are anger retaliatory and anger excitation. The anger retaliatory offenders, what is unique about them, and this is where Ted Bundy will see, is a crossover between anger retaliatory and anger excitation. The anger retaliatory killer targets victims that are symbolic to someone who has hurt them. in their previous life. So this type of offender actually feels that they are the victim and they're exacting revenge. And typically, they will be serial offenders. And one unique signature I always tell law enforcement to look for in an anger typology case is if the victim is posed with their back facing the exit to the room, to the area, whatever it may be. If they are deliberately posed like that, it is most likely an anger retaliatory killer, because their message in that and posing victims like that is saying, even in death, I have the ultimate control over you, even in death. So the case example I used for this, and granted this woman was not a serial offender, but the motivation behind it showed that she was an angry retaliatory offender. The case I chose was that of Susan Smith, which I'm sure some of our viewers are familiar with. She was an American woman who claimed that she had been carjacked with her two young sons that you can see on the top row here in color in the back of the minivan. And some investigators thought that that was very suspicious, rightly so, because there are not many carjackers who choose to take cars with infants in the back, and if they do, they're usually dropped off very quickly because they don't, that's not their motive to get the kids. The motive is to get the car. So some investigators, this was a novel investigative approach, and it's what's called a parallel investigation. Some investigators tried to prove her story was true, while some tried to prove that it was false. And what was brilliant about that was that they were able to find the children in a shorter amount of time. And what had actually happened was Susan Smith had driven to a lake and put the car in neutral and strapped the children in the back and pushed the car into the lake. And what came to be revealed in her background was that her father had committed suicide when she was very young. She had been molested by her stepfather, and her husband was having frequent infidelities. And so all of these men had victimized her. And so at least my take on the case is that these children, innocent and small as they were, represented all of those other men who had hurt her and betrayed her. All right, so turning now from these offenders, I'd like to discuss cold cases. And in America, we have hundreds of thousands of these types of cases. And basically, the standard definition of a cold case is a case where all leads have been exhausted. So there is no more active investigation that is occurring. One particularly startling statistic in the United States is that we have over 211,000 unsolved homicides just since 1980. And we have just recently discovered that there are over 40,000 unidentified remains in morgues across the country. So in response to this, the government has developed a program called NamUs, which basically is a website where it's the first centralized database for missing persons and for unidentified remains, where people and law enforcement agencies can enter their cases and search them. So there is a proactive strategy to combat these numbers. And recently in the media, I don't know if it's true in international countries, but certainly in the United States, we have seen a revitalized interest in cold cases, and the primary reason for that is because of media influences. We have reality shows now about cold cases. We have a show that is actually called Cold Case, and people are really taking a new interest in it, and the National Institute of Justice is actually providing funds to hundreds of law enforcement agencies across the United States to do DNA testing to help resolve some of these cases. So in my experience with cold cases, how a case becomes cold is a combination of two things. One, obviously, is investigative failures. Failing to recognize the case for what it is, failing to recognize the behaviors within the crime scene that would lead you to the correct perpetrator, and things like tunnel vision, where police get focused on one particular suspect and refuse to consider any others. So that's the first factor. The second factor is a loss of public interest. And primarily, we see a loss of public interest in cases where the victim is sadly from a lower socioeconomic status, or whether the victim is a sex worker. And what serial offenders count on is that loss of public interest. So generally we see that the anger retaliatory or anger excitation types will target what we call devalued victims in society, because they know that unfortunately not many people are going to care if these people disappear, and police departments unfortunately seem to respond differently to those types of cases until they realize it's a serial homicide, and then they have to react.